Okay, welcome back, or welcome if you're new to the channel. Today we're going to be examining one of the more influential and widely supported theories in modern criminology, that being social learning theory. I've already covered strain theory, deterrence theory, and social disorganization theory, but today we want to go over Ronald Akers' social learning theory. So this is really just asking the fundamental question of how do people become criminals, and instead of arguing that crime is the result of biology, like Lombroso, or personality, or even simply rational choice, social learning theory is proposing that criminal behavior is learned through social learning, right? Essentially the social processes that teach us virtually every other behavior in life. And one of the reasons why this theory remains so important is because it bridges both sociology and psychology together, and it recognizes how people are influenced by other people around them, and it also explains things like influences that will shape our beliefs and behaviors. And so throughout today's lecture, we're going to be tracing the historical development of social learning theory, beginning with Albert Bandura, Edwin Sutherland, and then examining how Ron Akers integrated all of these different ideas into criminology's most empirically supported theory. If you can't tell, I like social learning theory. I think it's one of the better criminological theories that actually has good empirical support. And so with this said, I may be a little bit biased when I'm covering it. But with this said, you should be, by the end of today's lecture, not only understanding what the four learning mechanisms are of social learning theory, but also how they interact to explain both criminal and deviant behaviors across quite a few different contexts. So one of the bigger misconceptions about social learning theory is that Ron Akers created this theory entirely on his own, but the reality is, if anything, Ron actually stole, he didn't steal, but he took inspiration from so many of the different scholars that came before him, and he transformed a lot of their ideas into his own social learning theory. But to be frank, one of the most important contributors of the theory was Albert Bandura, and Bandura's work really just demonstrated how people learn through observation, through watching other people, right? And the idea of observation later became one of the foundations of social learning theory and what Akers would later call imitation. And after Bandura, we had Edwin Sutherland, who shifted the criminological landscape away from biological explanations of crime by arguing that people and their behaviors, it's learned through interaction with other people. There's nothing biological about it. And so Edwin Sutherland created differential association theory, and this really did fundamentally change how criminologists thought about crime, because it's just suggesting that people develop behavior through their social relationships. They're not born inherently evil because of some biological explanation. And after Sutherland came Burgess and Akers, who actually recognized that simply explaining where criminal learning occurs isn't enough. And Burgess and Akers incorporated the principles of behavioral psychology, and particularly the concept of reinforcement, to explain why criminal behaviors continue over time. And lastly, we loop back to Ron Akers, who integrated all of these ideas into social learning theory. So rather than replacing any of these earlier theories and works, Akers just expanded them into the more comprehensive explanation of criminal and deviant behavior that I was talking about. So this historical progression here is definitely important. I wanted to go over all of these works, and we're going to be going over more of them in depth, but they really just demonstrate how criminological theories, they don't just emerge overnight. A lot of these works and the scholars behind them build on one another. Okay, so now we're getting into Albert Bandura and observational learning. So, although Bandura was a psychologist rather than a criminologist, his research still had enormous influence on social learning theory's development, and you might have even heard of his most famous study called the Boppo doll experiment. There's actually a scene in Family Guy where they kind of reference the Boppo doll too, back when I used to watch that. But anyway, the whole point of the experiment is that children were watching an adult interact aggressively with Boppo the inflatable clown, and some kids would watch these adults beat up the clown, and then in turn, once the children were placed in the same room with the clown, the children who had observed the aggressive model of the adults punching the clown, the children themselves actually started behaving aggressively towards Boppo the clown too, and they were copying the exact behaviors that they had witnessed. Once again, the significance of this experiment is profound, because before Bandura, many of the psychologists believed that people primarily learned through lots of punishments and direct rewards, and not just imitation. So Bandura's study here is really demonstrating that an individual can learn simply by observing another person, and this can happen before experiencing any sort of direct consequence themselves, whether it's good or bad. And this finding becomes one of the foundations of social learning theory, like I mentioned before. Akers later incorporated this into the concept of imitation, and it argued that individuals often acquire criminal and deviant behaviors just by watching others, peers, family members, or maybe just another role model in your life. And we're going to discuss this concept later in the lecture, but imitation is one of the key for learning mechanisms. But tying it back with Bandura, his work is really showing why observation itself is such a powerful source of behavioral learning. While Bandura explained how people learn behavior generally speaking, Edwin Sutherland asked a far more specific question: how do people learn crime? During the early 20th century, many of the criminologists believed the crime resulted from biological defects or inherited characteristics. Think of Cesare Lombroso. So Sutherland was rejecting all of these explanations and was instead arguing that criminal behavior develops through ordinary social interactions with other people. And so his most influential contribution to criminology by far was differential association theory, and this was introduced in Principles of Criminology. So according to Sutherland, individuals aren't born criminals, rather it's that they gradually learn criminal techniques, attitudes, and motivations through communication with people around them. And I shouldn't say that differential association was his most influential contribution, because he also did revolutionize criminology by introducing the concept of white-collar crime. And believe it or not, I mean, crime was often viewed as more of a problem that was primarily associated with poverty or lower classes. But Sutherland actually demonstrated that individuals in positions of wealth that have status and professional authority can also engage in serious criminal behavior. I mean, think of the Wolf of Wall Street, think of Bernie Madoff, think of FTX, right? Think of all of these crypto rug pulls and scams. I mean, these are very serious white-collar crimes. And so what Sutherland was doing here was challenging the long-standing assumptions about who is committing crime, and he also broadened the scope of criminological research as a result. And so, although social learning theory is associated with Ronald Akers, I mean, it's impossible to understand Akers' work without first understanding Sutherland's contributions through differential association theory. So what is differential association theory? Well, this theory represents one of the first comprehensive sociological explanations of criminal behavior. And really, at its core, the crux of this is that Sutherland is arguing that criminal behavior is learned through communication with other people, particularly those within our closest social relationships. So if we were to think about how we learn most behaviors in everyday life, we would learn language from our families, workplace expectations from our coworkers, and of course, just social norms from friends and communities and family. So Sutherland is arguing here that criminal behavior develops through this social learning process. And individuals learn several different things from those interactions. I mean, first, they're going to learn the practical techniques that they need to commit crime. Second, they're going to learn motives, attitudes, rationalizations for why they commit crime, and the justifications that make offending seem acceptable. So over time, if a person is exposed to more messages supporting law violations than messages discouraging it, then Sutherland is essentially imploring people to understand that offending would become more increasingly likely as a result of this. And as you can see here, I mean, I included the whole Salamanca family. We got Hector, Lalo, the two twins, and Tuco. You know, according to differential association theory, these people have excess of definitions that are favorable to law violation. And that's one of the more influential concepts that's introduced by Sutherland. So, in simple terms, it means that people become more likely to offend when the balance of messages that they receive from those around them support criminal behavior, and rather than condemning criminal behavior. So obviously, Hector was likely teaching Lalo, Tuco, and the twins why crime is good and necessary. And so, as a result, it became the Salamanca crime family, fictional as it may be. And so the idea here behind differential association theory is actually just more of the roots and the foundation for everything that Akers would later develop. And we'll see in the next slide here that Sutherland's theory also left several important questions unanswered. A lot of these questions would eventually evolve into what Burgess and Akers would expand and what we now know as social learning theory. To summarize his theory, Sutherland developed what became known as the 9 different propositions of differential association theory. So rather than memorizing all of these individually, just think of these as one explanation for how criminal behavior is learned, because this is far from parsimonious, as you can tell. So I'm going to just briefly walk through all 9 propositions. First, criminal behavior is learned, not inherited. Second, criminal behavior is learned through communication with other people. Third, and the most important learning occurs within intimate personal groups, such as family members, close friends, peer networks, not from television or just a stranger off the streets. Fourth, people learn not only from the techniques of committing crime, but also the motives, rationalizations, attitudes, and values that make criminal behavior seem acceptable. Fifth, individuals develop what Sutherland called definitions favorable or unfavorable to law violation. So in other words here, they're learning about beliefs about whether or not breaking the law is acceptable or not. Sixth, people become delinquent when they experience an excess of definitions that become favorable to law violation over definitions unfavorable to it. And this is one of the more influential propositions because it explains why someone ultimately chooses crime. Seventh, the associations vary in their frequency, duration, priority, and intensity. So think about who you spend the most time with, how long you've known them, how early those relationships began, and how influential those people are in your life. Eighth, the process of learning criminal behavior is the same as learning any other behavior. Crime isn't learned through a unique process. It follows the same principles as learning to play a sport, driving a car, or playing an instrument. And lastly, ninth, although criminal behavior reflects general needs and values such as wanting money, status, or respect, those needs don't explain crime by themselves, because law-abiding people pursue these same goals without breaking the law. And I wanted to include a pop culture example here. So think about Michael Corleone from The Godfather. I mean, at the beginning of this film, Michael wants nothing to do with the mafia, and he even tries to distance himself from his family's criminal lifestyle. But over time, through his constant interaction with his father, brothers, and other members of the Corleone family, he learns not only how organized crime works, but just the different values, justifications, and rationalizations that make violence and crime seem acceptable to him. And so he's exposed to an excess of definitions that become favorable to him violating the law, just like Sutherland said. And because his relationships, the people who are closest to him, I mean, these are his family, Santino, etc., and Fredo. But these are long-lasting ties, and they began early in life, and so they involve the people that are most important to him, and they carry tremendous influence. And so by the end of the story, Michael has become not only the head of the Corleone crime family, Sutherland would argue that Michael wasn't even born a mafia boss. He learned criminal behavior through differential association. And so the major takeaway from these propositions is that criminal behavior is learned just like any other behavior. And according to Sutherland, our closest relationships shape not only what we do, but also how we think about right and wrong. Okay, so now on to some of the limitations of differential association theory. So, for example here, Sutherland explained where criminal learning occurs through social interaction, but he really didn't talk much about why certain behaviors continue over time while other behaviors start to disappear. So, for an example, imagine if you had two teenagers who were both exposed to delinquent peers, and one teenager continues to offend for different years, and then the other teenager stops after a single incident. Well, differential association theory doesn't clearly explain why these different outcomes occur, and the theory also gives relatively little attention to the role of rewards and punishments. So, we know from everyday experience that behaviors that produce positive outcomes are more likely to be repeated, whereas behaviors producing negative consequences will often decline. Sutherland acknowledged learning, but he doesn't fully incorporate these behavioral principles into differential association theory. And so finally, I just want to direct the attention to observational learning. We know from Bandura's work that people frequently learn simply by watching others, even before they do personally experience any rewards or punishments. So once again, these were just limitations, not fatal flaws with differential association theory, and if anything, it just provided more of an opportunity for Burgess and Akers to come along and actually expand and improve differential association. So now on to Burgess and Akers. So they recognized that Sutherland had built an outstanding foundation with differential association theory, but naturally, just with some of the limitations we talked about, they believed that it could definitely be strengthened by incorporating principles from behavioral psychology. And their major innovation was introducing the concept of operant conditioning into criminology. Operant conditioning suggests that behaviors followed by rewarding consequences are more likely to be repeated, whereas behaviors that are followed by unpleasant consequences are less likely to occur in the future. So when we apply this to crime, it essentially means that if somebody is committing an offense and experiences rewards from that behavior, such as money or peer approval, excitement, or an increased social status, for example, then they're more likely to repeat that behavior. And conversely, if offending were to result in just punishment over and over again, well, the behavior is going to become less attractive as a result. And Burgess and Akers referred to this revised perspective as differential association reinforcement theory. So this is representing an important transition because it combines Sutherland's sociological insights with well-established principles from behavioral psychology. And the work of Burgess and Akers here is directly laying into the groundwork for what Akers would later develop of social learning theory. Ron Akers took the next major step by integrating several existing ideas into one comprehensive theory of criminal behavior. He took inspiration from Bandura, Sutherland, his own work with Burgess, and then he proposed that crime develops through four interconnected learning mechanisms: differential association, definitions, differential reinforcement, and imitation. Now, one of Akers' greatest contributions was demonstrating that these mechanisms don't operate independently. Instead, they continuously influence one another through an individual's life. And naturally, this makes sense. We learn from the people around us. We develop beliefs about what behaviors are acceptable. We observe how other people behave. We modify our own actions to be socially acceptable. And then a lot of the time we modify our actions based around rewards and or punishments. And the integration here made social learning theory much more comprehensive than differential association theory alone. And it also made the theory easier to test empirically because all of these mechanisms could be measured and examined separately while still contributing to a unified explanation of criminal behavior. So this combination of strong theoretical foundations and extensive empirical support is one of the primary reasons that social learning theory remains one of the more influential theories in criminology to date. Everything we've discussed so far leads us to the four mechanisms that define social learning theory. So think of these mechanisms not as four separate theories, but as four parts of the same learning process. So the first mechanism, differential association, which you've heard of already, this focuses on who we learn from, our family, friends, classmates, coworkers, etc., and just other important social relationships that determine the people who influence our behavior. The second mechanism, definitions, refer to the beliefs and attitudes that we develop regarding whether or not particular behaviors are acceptable or unacceptable, and these beliefs help shape the choices that we make. The third, differential reinforcement, explains why some behaviors continue over time. Behaviors that are rewarded obviously become more likely to be repeated, whereas behaviors that produce negative consequences become less likely. And finally, imitation recognizes that individuals often learn by observing others. So we don't always have to experience something ourselves to learn from it. Simply watching a respected or influential individual can actually shape your future behavior. And of course, if you guys couldn't tell by now, I like mob movies, mob culture in general, so I had to include The Sopranos, particularly the relationship between Chris and Tony. So Christopher here his criminal behavior is really just illustrating all four of the learning mechanisms working together. This is a really good example. Through differential association, Chris nearly spends all of his time with Tony and the other members like Polly Walnuts in the crime family. And Chris doesn't have a father either, so again, he's surrounding himself with individuals who normalize organized crime. And through that, he's forming definitions where he's becoming to believe that violence, extortion, and even murder are justified if they protect the family and strengthen his crime organization. So this, and through differential reinforcement, all of his behaviors are rewarded with money, promotions, he becomes an underboss, he gets more respect, higher status within the mafia, and, it makes his behaviors more likely to continue just because of that differential reinforcement. And lastly, imitation. Chris is just constantly observing Tony's leadership, his decision-making, and other various criminal behaviors. So Chris naturally, sees Tony as like a father figure. And Akers would state that these four mechanisms of social learning theory, they don't operate independently, and they reinforce one another to shape criminal behavior over time, as you can see with the personification of Christopher Moltisanti. So we're going to be diving into each of these learning mechanisms individually, but I just want to implore all of you to understand that Akers never intended any of these concepts to operate independently of one another. Social learning theory is a process, and it's not for separate explanations of crime. So with this said, just to provide you with another example here, imagine a teenager that's entering a new friend group. First, the teenager would develop these differential associations by spending time with these peers, and then through his interactions, he's going to start to develop definitions about what behaviors are acceptable, right? And from there, he might even observe older friends engaging in delinquent behavior, which could introduce the role of imitation. And finally, if the behaviors are rewarded from imitating his peers, etc., and forming these definitions, then it's likely he'll gain some sort of financial gain or peer approval, potentially. Maybe he'll just avoid embarrassment, and then he'll be more likely to continue these behaviors through reinforcement, differential reinforcement. So that will also shape future behavior and then continued learning. And again, none of these mechanisms work in isolation of one another. So Akers is just arguing that crime is not explained by one single variable, and instead it emerges from the interaction of these four learning processes that just operate together over time. So now we're going to begin with the first and arguably most important learning mechanism, differential association. So differential association simply refers to the people and group of which we spend the most time with. So throughout our lives, we're surrounded by family members, friends, classmates, coworkers, etc. these relationships will expose us to different attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. And Sutherland always argued that these associations differ in four important ways, being the frequency, duration, priority, and intensity. Now, frequency refers to how often we interact with someone. Duration refers to how long the relationship lasts. Priority considers whether or not the relationship developed early in life, and when the individuals are often more impressionable than not. And lastly, intensity reflects how emotionally important or influential that relationship is. So the idea here is pretty straightforward. The people who occupy the largest roles in our lives are generally going to exert the greatest influence on our attitudes and behaviors. So, like I said before, I gave you the example, this is a pretty cringe photo, but, best we can do from Google stock images. So imagine a teenager whose closest friends are just regularly stealing cars. And at first glance, let's say the teenager might have no interest in offending, but after spending several months or even years with this peer group, several things are likely to happen. They start to learn techniques for stealing vehicles. They hear repeated justifications for why this behavior is acceptable, and they're going to observe friends benefiting from crime and receiving encouragement to participate themselves. So let's say no one is forcing the teenager to commit crime. Instead, it's the social environment is gradually changing what seems to be normal or acceptable. And this illustrates why social learning theory places such a strong emphasis on peer groups and close relationships. And research has consistently supported this idea. For example, Pratt and colleagues' meta-analysis actually found that differential association is one of the strongest and most consistent predictors of criminal behavior across numerous studies. And this doesn't mean that peers determine everything, but it does suggest that our closer social relationships will play a major role in shaping criminal and conventional behaviors. So while differential association does explain who influences us, it doesn't really explain what individuals actually learn from those relationships. So like we were talking about earlier, if you have like two teenagers who are growing up in the same neighborhood, attending the same school and all that other stuff, let's say despite the same social environment, one will engage in delinquency and the other doesn't. Why would this occur? Now, Akers argues that the answer lies in the beliefs and values that individuals develop through their relationships. So simply interacting with delinquent peers does not automatically produce criminal behavior. Individuals must also develop beliefs that justify, excuse, or support offending. And of course, this led us to the second major learning mechanism of definitions. So while differential association identifies our source of influence being peer groups, definitions explain how individuals interpret those influences and decide whether particular behaviors are acceptable or not. So definitions. If I could just sum this into one sentence, I would break it down by saying, do I believe that this behavior is acceptable? Obviously, some definitions are clearly unfavorable toward crime. A person might strongly believe that stealing is morally wrong and reprehensible, and that belief would discourage criminal behavior. And other definitions are, going to be obviously favorable toward law violation. And so someone might tell you that it's acceptable to steal if you're desperate, or violence is justified when someone disrespects you. So these beliefs make offending appear far more acceptable under certain circumstances. And many definitions are also neutralizing, where many individuals will actually justify behavior without fully rejecting conventional values. So a person might admit that stealing is generally wrong while convincing themselves that their particular situation is an exception. And according to social learning theory, criminal behavior becomes increasingly likely when individuals develop an excess of definitions favorable to law violation over definitions that are unfavorable to offending. So, in other words, people don't simply learn how to commit crime, they also learn why they believe it's acceptable. Okay, so let's look at definitions in practice in everyday life. So imagine you have two college students who are both under tremendous academic pressure. Both of them have an opportunity to cheat an important exam. Let's say one student refuses because they believe that cheating is fundamentally wrong, regardless of the consequences, and the other student convinces themselves that, well, everybody cheats sometimes, and I have no other choice if I want to pass this. So, the students here are facing the same situation, but their definitions are just leading them to very different decisions. And this is exactly what Akers meant by definitions. So, social learning theory is arguing that behavior is influenced not only by other people around us, but also the meanings that we assign to everyday actions that we take. And we often develop these beliefs gradually through interactions with people like family members, friends, classmates, etc. Definitions, notably, they can also change over time. Somebody who initially views drug use, or just theft, robbery as unacceptable, they might gradually adopt more favorable attitudes after repeated exposure to peers who can normalize or justify those behaviors. The overall important point here is that people don't simply imitate behavior automatically, and they interpret situations through their own beliefs and values, and these beliefs play a critical role in determining whether or not criminal behavior appears to be acceptable or unacceptable. Okay, so differential reinforcement. This is why some behaviors continue while others disappear. So differential reinforcement focuses on the consequences of a person's behaviors. In simple terms, behaviors that produce rewarding outcomes become more likely to occur again, while behaviors followed by negative consequences become less likely. And these rewards don't have to be financial. Like I said earlier, they can be things like peer approval, an increased level of social status, excitement, praise, or just simply avoiding embarrassment. And likewise, the punishments might include things like legal sanctions, parental discipline, social disapproval, or losing valued relationships. So Akers did distinguish between direct reinforcement and vicarious reinforcement. So direct reinforcement occurs when we personally experience the consequences of our behaviors, and vicarious reinforcement occurs when we observe someone else being rewarded or punished, and then we learn from their experiences. So the concept is definitely important because criminal behavior often persists when an individual repeatedly experiences rewards that outweigh the perceived costs. And Burgess and Akers argue that reinforcement is one of the key mechanisms that maintains learned behavior over time. So again, just to give you another example of differential reinforcement in practice, let's say we have a teenager who is shoplifting for the first time, and they successfully steal merchandise without being caught. Well, rather than receiving any sort of punishment, they obtain something that they wanted, and they might even receive praise or admiration from some of their friends. And these positive outcomes are going to reinforce that behavior, so it's going to make future shoplifting more likely as a result. And the same process can occur in many other situations. A drug dealer might continue selling drugs because of financial rewards and social status, and a student who cheats on an exam and earns a high grade without any consequences might become more willing to cheat again in the future. So in each case here, you can just see that behavior is being strengthened because the individual is perceiving that the benefits are outweighing the costs. And that's precisely why Burgess and Akers emphasized reinforcement in their revision of differential association theory. They argued that learning where criminal behavior comes from is only part of the explanation. To fully understand crime, we also need to explain why those behaviors continue after they've been learned. Okay, so lastly, the fourth and final mechanism is imitation. So this was a concept that was heavily influenced by Albert Bandura's research on observational learning, and imitation refers to learning behavior by watching others. So throughout our lives, we're going to observe people like our parents, siblings, friends, teachers, coworkers, celebrities, athletes, and a bunch of social media influencers, unfortunately, and nowadays. I sound like an old man even saying that. But yeah, these individuals serve as just more of behavioral models that demonstrate what actions are possible and what consequences those actions can sometimes produce. So imitation is especially likely when the model is somebody that we admire, trust, or identify with. Think about all the cringe boys who like Andrew Tate, or some of the people who want to be part of the manosphere, and they hope to emulate claviculars like looks maxing harder than last time, or whatever it is, right? They imitate these behaviors because on a very superficial level, they obviously appear to be successful or rewarding, but it's important to understand that imitation is generally most influential during the initial acquisition of behaviors. So once individuals have repeatedly performed a behavior themselves, differential reinforcement often becomes more important in maintaining that behavior over time. And Bandura's work demonstrated that observation alone can be a powerful teacher, and Akers incorporated this insight into social learning theory by recognizing that people often acquire new behaviors long before they personally experience rewards or punishments. Now, imitation in practice, like we talked about earlier with the Boppo doll experiment, this provides one of the just clearest demonstrations of imitation overall. These children, they learned simply by observing another person's actions, and when Bandura was studying this aggression, rather than just crime specifically, the principle applies much more broadly, and you can see how adolescents might imitate delinquent peers, how employees might adopt the same workplace norms by observing experienced coworkers, and individuals might even learn criminal techniques through online communities or digital media. So this is why imitation remains an important part of social learning theory. It helps explain how entirely new behaviors can be acquired without direct personal experience. And once these behaviors are performed, however, reinforcement and continued social integration will largely determine whether or not they become long-term patterns of behavior. So At this point, we've examined all four mechanisms proposed by Ron Akers, and on the next few slides, I really just want to bring these concepts together and examine the extensive empirical evidence before overall supporting social learning theory and discussing its strengths, limitations, and implications for crime prevention. Alright, so now that we've examined each mechanism individually, I just want to bring everything together here. I'm going to give you guys a little example as I've been doing. So, imagine that you have a new employee joining you at your workplace, and at the workplace there's just a bunch of unethical behavior that's very commonplace. So, through differential association, they spend time with the coworkers, obviously, in the workplace, who routinely violate the company rules. And as those interactions continue, they begin developing definitions that justify cutting corners or bending the rules. And they also observe some of the more experienced employees engaging in these behaviors. And they also observe some of the more experienced employees engaging in these behaviors without any consequences, which introduces the role of imitation. And finally, if these behaviors are rewarded with promotions, praise, or financial benefits, differential reinforcement will only strengthen the likelihood that the new employee is going to behave in the same way. So, the important point here with this example is that there is no single mechanism that explains criminal behavior by itself. And defending is going to develop through the interaction of these four learning processes over time. And Akers emphasized that understanding crime requires examining the complete learning environment rather than only focusing on one variable. So let's get into the empirical support. This is actually one of the greatest strengths that social learning theory has. It has an extraordinary amount of empirical support and research supporting it. So unlike some of the other criminological theories that have received mixed or inconsistent evidence at best, social learning theory has been examined across decades of research involving juveniles, adults, violent offenders, substance users, white-collar offenders, and many other populations. So it can explain, as you can see, a lot of crime. And the evidence has consistently shown that differential association and definitions are among some of the strongest predictors of criminal and deviant behaviors, with differential reinforcement also contributing by helping explain why learned behaviors start to persist over time, and imitation appears to be especially important during the initial acquisition of these new behaviors. Obviously, with this slide, I gave a little notice to Pratt and colleagues' meta-analysis, because I just thought it was particularly important. They really just synthesized findings from numerous studies rather than relying on a single data set. So this review essentially concluded that social learning variables demonstrate moderate to strong relationships with offending across diverse populations and offense types. And this breadth of evidence is one of the primary reasons that social learning theory continues to occupy such a prominent place in contemporary criminology. And I would say another major strength of social learning theory is its versatility. There are a lot of applications for this. And it's because of the fact that the theory focuses on general learning processes rather than just one specific type of crime, that you can apply social learning theory to an enormous variety of criminal and deviant behaviors, as I mentioned in the last slide. And researchers have successfully used social learning theory to explain things, like I said before, white-collar crime, violent offending, substance use, cybercrime, and even things like police misconduct. There's actually a good book called The Danger Imperative, which goes more into the police misconduct. But that aside, all of these criminal behaviors, I mean, yes, they appear to be very different on the surface, like violent offending and cybercrime, but when you look more closely at them, I mean, they're all involving individuals who are still learning attitudes, behaviors, and expectations through their interactions with others. And one example that I highlighted on this slide is coming from Chappelle and Piccaro's work on police misconduct. So they were really arguing that officers develop occupational norms through interaction with peers and supervisors. This in turn is becoming more of an organizational reinforcement that's going to help them maintain the behaviors over time due to this policing culture, right? So, if nothing else, I mean, I've provided you so many examples, but this is just illustrating that the same learning processes can help explain street crime and also help us understand misconduct within professional organizations. And so in closing here, the broad applicability of social learning theory is one of the reasons why it remains so influential. So after examining all of the evidence, I think it's pretty evident that social learning theory has extensive empirical support. It explains both the acquisition and maintenance of criminal behaviors. The theory is also successfully integrating insights from sociology and psychology, which is notable. And another key aspect of the strength is how parsimonious it is. So despite explaining such a wide range of criminal behaviors, the theory is still relying on only 4 interconnected learning variables. So in my opinion, I mean, this makes it a relatively straightforward, still being capable of explaining complex patterns of offending, which is very notable. And finally, because social learning theory also identifies specific learning processes, it also offers practical guidance for prevention and intervention, which makes it valuable for both researchers and practitioners. So, no criminological theory is perfect. Social learning theory is no exception to this, and it does have a couple limitations. One of the limitations being that the theory was originally developed to explain behavior at the individual level. So, although researchers have successfully extended it to policing organizations for police misconduct and also a couple other institutions looking at white collar crime, doing so does require an additional assumptions that go beyond Akers' original formulation. The theory, that's definitely one of its primary limitations. And it also places a little bit of less emphasis on broader structural conditions. Things like social disorganization theory ties into, such as like poverty, inequality, neighborhood disadvantage, and discrimination. And these factors may influence who people associate with and the opportunities that they experience. But social learning theory generally treats all of this as more of a background condition rather than a direct cause of offending. And researchers have also identified methodological challenges. For example, delinquent peers in defending often influence one another simultaneously, so it makes it a little bit difficult to determine whether or not peers cause delinquency or whether or not delinquent individuals simply choose similar friends, which can be a problem commonly referred to as the selection versus socialization debate. And finally, concepts such as definitions and reinforcement can be difficult to measure, but even with this said, the limitations have generated productive research rather than undermining the overall value of social learning theory. So if criminal behavior is learned, well, what can we do about it? Can we also unlearn criminal behavior? Can this be redirected? Well, social learning theory encourages us to focus on changing the learning environments that shape behavior in the first place. So this can involve things like strengthening pro-social peer relationships, expanding mentoring programs, giving people like positive role models, reinforcing law-abiding behavior through families, schools, workplaces, different community organizations, and within organizations such as police departments, it also highlights the importance of ethical leadership, supervision, and of course accountability, because these environments communicate what behaviors are to be expected and rewarded. In other words, social learning theory suggests that lasting reductions in crime depend not only on deterring misconduct, but also on creating social environments that consistently reward conventional behavior while discouraging criminal conduct. So let's conclude by reviewing the major details that we've discussed today. Social learning theory argues that criminal behavior is learned rather than inherited. Building upon the work of Bandura, Sutherland, Burgess and Akers, Ron Akers proposed that crime develops through four interconnected learning mechanisms: differential association, definitions, differential reinforcement, and imitation. And together these mechanisms explain how individuals learn criminal behavior, why they continue to engage in it, and how changes in social environments can encourage more conventional behaviors. Perhaps the greatest contribution of social learning theory is that it reminds us that crime is fundamentally a social process. So people are influenced by those around them. They develop beliefs about their experiences, and they observe the behaviors of others, and they respond to rewards and punishments throughout their lives. One of the reasons why this theory remains so influential is its remarkable empirical support, like I said earlier. Decades of research have consistently demonstrated that these learning processes can help explain a wide range of criminal and deviant behaviors, which really does make social learning theory one of the most robust and enduring perspectives in modern criminology. So with all of this said, I hope you can take something away from this. This concludes my lecture on social learning theory. This was more for my comprehensive exam, just a nice little review aside from the work I've been doing. In my next lecture, I'm going to be going over labeling theory, and I'm going to continue to examine criminological theories and compare the different perspectives that hope to explain the causes of crime. But with this said, I thank you for your time, and if you enjoyed this, maybe give it a like, and if not, tell me why in the comment section below.